March 15th, 1942. The war rooms of Germany buzzed with confident murmurs. Maps covered tables, red pins marking the territories they believed would bend under their command. Reports arrived of American tank production. One line made them laugh. 25,000 tanks? A voice scoffed. Impossible. America could never build so many. Not in 5 years, not in 10. They didn't see the assembly lines, the factories humming day and night, the steel melting in furnaces larger than any city hall. They didn't see the workers, hundreds of thousands, moving like clockwork, welding, forging, testing, refining. Meanwhile, on a distant American farm-turned-factory site, Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes leaned over the chassis of a Sherman tank. Sparks flew as welders sealed the armor plates, belts of steel feeding through rollers, as if the metal itself knew it had a destiny. Every Sherman would carry 75 millimeters of artillery, 400 horsepower, and a promise to be more than a tank. It would be a hammer striking with unstoppable rhythm, backed by the industrial might of a nation. In Berlin, the laughter continued. They didn't understand the arithmetic of America. For every tank they imagined America could make, the U.S. would deliver twice the number. The first sight. June 1943. The Germans finally saw a shipment rolling through North Africa. M4 Shermans, 60-ton shadows of iron and steel, engines growling, treads churning dust like thunder across the desert. Field commanders froze. They had expected a handful, perhaps a few hundred, not lines stretching for miles, not a rolling wall of mechanized fury. One officer muttered, "They've doubled it! They've doubled it!" The Americans didn't shout. They didn't brag. They simply kept moving, the tanks rolling through the sand, into the eyes of the world, into the calculations the German staff had once dismissed as fantasy. Mechanics of supremacy. Each Sherman was not just a machine. It carried 97 rounds of main gun shells, machine guns on turret and hull, and a crew trained to operate as a single unit. Every movement was choreographed, every shot calculated. Across the Atlantic, factory floors churned. Every day, 200 tanks left the plants, welded and armored, each carrying not just firepower, but American determination. By the end of the year, the Germans would see the numbers. 50,000 tanks, double their ridicule, double their imagination. And the laughter in the war rooms slowly died, replaced by silence that tasted like iron. The Desert Test. In North Africa, the first American tank units engaged Axis forces. The Shermans moved in coordinated lines. The sound of treads over sand was like a drumbeat of inevitability. The German panzers fired. Panzer IVs, Tigers, all the pride of a mechanized army. They scored hits. Some Shermans went down. But for every Sherman lost, 3 more had already arrived, each carrying men trained not just to fire, but to maneuver, to outflank, to endure. The arithmetic was simple. The Germans realized, too late, that numbers were more than quantity. They were psychology, momentum, and inevitability. Soldiers on both sides felt it. The roar of engines, the whine of gearboxes, the clank of treads on stone. It was a rhythm the Germans could not match. Their tanks were fewer, their crews exhausted, their morale cracking. The fog of war. By the time Operation Torch reached its peak, the Germans understood a terrifying truth. The U.S. had multiplied their imagined production. Where Germany expected parity, they faced overwhelming scale. Where they had counted victories, they faced attrition. The Americans didn't just fight tanks, they moved cities of steel, a rolling testament to what industrial ingenuity could achieve. And behind every Sherman were crews who believed in their machines, trained to turn iron into strategy, numbers into dominance. The laughter of 1942 had turned to the stunned silence of 1943, and the war was beginning to feel like an equation they could no longer solve. The North African sun blazed overhead, baking the desert into a furnace. Dust rose in thick clouds from the advancing columns of Sherman tanks. their engines growling in synchrony, like beasts trained to obey a single mind. American crews crouched low, hands gripping controls, eyes scanning the horizon for the glint of German steel. Lieutenant Daniel Harper wiped sweat from his brow as the first Panzer IVs appeared over a ridge. Their silhouettes were unmistakable, the pride of an army long considered invincible. Harper swallowed. He had trained for this moment for months, yet nothing could have prepared him for the sight of those tanks lined in the sand, sun reflecting off their angled armor like blades of silver. "Steady, boys," he called into the radio. "Focus on formation. Don't fire until I say." Across the ridge, German crews spotted the approaching Shermans. There was a moment of disbelief, a pause in the rhythm of war, as soldiers realized the Americans had brought more than just steel. They had brought an unbroken line of tanks, hundreds stretching beyond the horizon. Their calculators and maps could not account for this. The first exchange of fire shattered the air. The Panzer IVs let loose their 75mm rounds, cutting into Shermans at medium range. Explosions erupted, sending sand and shrapnel into the air. Harper's tank shuddered as a shell glanced off its turret. He gritted his teeth and returned fire, aiming carefully, letting the gunner line up the shot. Bang! The Panzer's gun barrel jerked violently. Another Sherman rolled forward to take the lost position, relentless, as if the desert itself demanded it. The mathematics of battle revealed themselves in real time. For every Sherman that fell, 3 more had already taken its place. Their crews coordinated, moving with precision across the dunes. Each tank's fire was synchronized, not chaotic. The Germans tried flanking maneuvers, but the American lines adjusted like clockwork. It was a living machine, each Sherman a gear turning in perfect timing with hundreds of others. In the chaos, Sergeant James Callahan spotted a Tiger in the distance, its massive frame dwarfing his own tank. The roar of its engine was terrifying, a promise of destruction. But as it advanced, more Shermans swarmed its flanks. Their 75mm guns fired in unison, exploiting every weak point in its armor. The Tiger struck a Sherman, tearing through steel and killing its crew instantly. But 2 more Shermans were already on its sides, shells pounding relentlessly. The sheer number overwhelmed it. On the German side, panic began to ripple through the ranks. Commanders shouted orders, recalculated positions, and tried to coordinate retreats, but the arithmetic was unforgiving. The Americans had brought double the tanks they had expected. Every attack met a counterattack amplified by volume, speed, and coordination. Numbers had become destiny. Harper's Sherman rumbled forward, his tracks slicing through the dunes. Another explosion rocked the turret. This time, he knew it was close. A Panzer crew had scored a direct hit, but the reinforced armor held. The gunner fired again, hitting the German tank squarely in its flank. Sparks flew, smoke rose, and another vehicle of the so-called Invincible Panzer Division was disabled. Harper didn't exult. There was no time. The desert was full of steel and fire, and the fight moved forward relentlessly. In a hidden dune crevice, a group of German officers huddled over a map. Their faces were pale, lines of fear etching their features. "They have more than we thought," one whispered. "Double what we expected." They recalculated, red-marked positions, tried to adjust. Nothing seemed to change the fact staring them in the face. The Americans weren't just fighting. They were overwhelming. They had turned industrial power into battlefield inevitability. The battle stretched on for hours. Dust clouds obscured vision. Gunfire created a constant percussion of chaos, and the air smelled of burnt metal and scorched sand. Harper's crew barely spoke, hands moving over controls automatically, muscles trained to respond without thought. Each Sherman was more than a tank. It was a node in a larger machine, and that machine was unstoppable. By nightfall, the German forces had been pushed back across the dunes. Rows of destroyed panzers dotted the battlefield, their steel skeletons glinting in the sinking sun. Yet the Americans pressed forward, unbroken. Even the losses they sustained could not disrupt the rhythm. Every destroyed Sherman was quickly replaced by another arriving from the supply lines, a steady tide of iron that never ceased. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. On the American side, confidence surged. The crews knew their numbers, their training, and the reliability of their tanks gave them an edge no enemy could match. On the German side, disbelief and fear began to replace strategy. How could an army possibly fight against forces that not only met their expectations but doubled them without pause? Harper's squadron pulled back for the night, engines idling, treads leaving deep tracks in the desert. Around the fires, men cleaned guns, welded minor repairs, and spoke in low tones about the absurd scale of their operations. For months, they had drilled, they had trained, they had imagined the power of American industry. Now, they were living it. They understood that victory wasn't just skill or bravery, it was numbers, relentless, unstoppable, and multiplied across miles of battlefield. In a small command post far from the front, German officers stared at reports detailing losses. Tanks destroyed, 120. Tanks lost on American side, 20. The math was simple and unforgiving. They had laughed at the plan for 25 Zero tanks. America had built 50 Zero, and now in the desert sands of North Africa, that reality was killing them. The sun set over dunes scarred with fire and steel. The American lines remained unbroken. Every tank ready, every crew alert, every Sherman a promise delivered. For the first time, the Germans understood that industrial power, harnessed with strategy, could redefine the battlefield. The desert was silent, save for the occasional hiss of cooling engines. Harper stared into the horizon, knowing the fight was far from over. The next day, the Shermans would advance again, and the Panzers would be forced to meet the inexorable tide of American steel once more. The laughter of 1942 had been replaced by a grim reckoning. Numbers were destiny, and the Americans had doubled the destiny the Germans had expected. The Apennine Mountains of Italy were shrouded in mist, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and gunpowder. It was early November, 1943, and the American Fifth Army pressed forward from Salerno. Sherman tanks leading the way through the narrow passes and rocky ridges. Lieutenant Daniel Harper, recently rotated from North Africa, had seen desert sand and blood, but this terrain was different, claustrophobic, jagged, and unforgiving. Yet the Shermans moved with a quiet determination, engines low and throaty, treads gripping the uneven ground as if the mountains themselves had been trained to carry them. Ahead, German infantry and armor awaited, dug into fortified ridges, bunkers carved from stone, their panzer divisions confident they could stall the Americans in the constricted passes. They had studied the reports from North Africa, but disbelief lingered. How could a nation allegedly so far from the battlefields deliver not just quantity, but a continuous stream of tanks capable of striking anywhere? Harper peered through his periscope, noting the first signs of German armor on the ridge. Panzer IVs and the occasional Tiger were hidden among the rocks, their barrels glinting through the mist. Orders crackled through the radio. Form line, ready to advance at my mark. As the first Sherman column crested a narrow pass, German guns opened fire. The desert had been a test of endurance, but here the mountains amplified every shot, every explosion echoing off the cliffs like rolling thunder. One Sherman was struck, its turret twisting violently, smoke curling from the engine compartment. Harper's heart skipped a beat, but he adjusted formation, his crew already operating with the efficiency born of years in combat. Another Sherman moved forward to fill the breach, its treads grinding the wet earth as it aimed at a concealed panzer. Bang! The German tank rocked from a direct hit, smoke and fire licking the misty morning. The Germans tried to regroup, sending infantry into the narrow pass to slow the advance. But the Shermans were not alone. Artillery and infantry worked in unison, with the tanks acting as both spear and shield. Every move the Americans made seemed to anticipate the German reaction, a product of coordination, practice, and sheer numbers. A single Sherman could pin an enemy squad. A dozen could obliterate an entrenched position before reinforcements could arrive. In the German command post, officers stared at reports and maps with mounting disbelief. Each hillfall, each destroyed bunker, each abandoned panzer told the same story. The Americans had brought more steel than any plan had assumed possible. The laughter from 2 years prior, mocking 25 Zero tanks, had long vanished. The 50 Zero, built across factories, ports, and assembly lines, were now making themselves known, mile by mile, ridge by ridge. As Harper's squad moved deeper into the mountains, the terrain shifted into valleys of mud and rain-soaked fields. German artillery tried to disrupt the lines, shells screaming overhead, tearing chunks from the earth. Yet for every Sherman destroyed, 3 more were already in position. Supply lines were relentless, factory production unstoppable. The arithmetic of war had shifted irrevocably. Amidst the advancing tanks, Harper noticed a column of Italian civilians fleeing nearby villages. The war had become not just a clash of armies, but a landscape of devastation, of entire regions swept in the wake of unstoppable machinery. The Americans advanced methodically, with discipline and patience, yet every tank, every shell, carried with it an implicit message: surrender to scale or perish. By mid-November, the Shermans had reached the outskirts of Monte Cassino. German defensive positions were formidable, bunkers carved into rock, minefields spanning hundreds of meters. Yet the Americans did not falter. Harper watched as engineers cleared paths, as tanks coordinated with infantry, using their guns to suppress bunkers while riflemen advanced. One by one, the German positions fell. The psychological effect on German troops was undeniable. They had trained to respect the panzer divisions of old, to trust in superior design, armor, and firepower. Now, everywhere they turned, they faced not just a tank, but a stream of tanks that seemed endless. Each loss chipped away at morale. The soldiers whispered among themselves, "How could an enemy produce more than we could destroy? How could they fight with such consistency, with such relentless timing?" Even high command, secluded in their mountain posts, felt the weight of inevitability. Reports from the field spoke of overwhelming numbers, strategic adaptability, and tanks arriving faster than any could be destroyed. For every tactical success they achieved, the Americans countered twice over. Every calculation of advantage was neutralized by sheer production capacity. Harper and his crew pressed on, moving through valleys, across rivers, over scorched villages. Each Sherman was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of the industrial engine of America, of a nation transforming its factories into extensions of the battlefield. Every destroyed German tank, every bunker cleared, was proof that laughter in Berlin had underestimated the arithmetic of power. By December, the Allies had broken through to the Liri Valley. German forces were retreating, reassembling where possible, but the pattern was clear. Wherever Shermans appeared, the lines eventually gave way. Numbers were not just statistics, they were inevitability incarnate. Harper's tank crew, soaked, exhausted, yet alert, realized that war was no longer just about tactics or courage. It was about the relentless multiplication of power, delivered on time, with precision, and without pause. As night fell, the mountains echoed with distant artillery, the hum of engines, and the soft whistle of bullets cutting the air. Harper looked at the horizon, knowing that this was only the beginning. Across the Atlantic, assembly lines would continue, factories would continue, and more tanks would arrive, ready to repeat the cycle. The Germans had laughed at 25-0. America had built 50-0. And in Italy, the cost of that miscalculation was written in iron, fire, and blood. Harper's crew huddled around a small fire in the wreckage of a captured village. They shared rations, cleaned weapons, and spoke quietly about what they had seen that day. Not victory, not heroism, but the realization that war had become a measure of production, coordination, and persistence. They understood now that the Shermans were more than machines. They were inevitability, made tangible, rolling across mountains and valleys, reshaping every battlefield they touched. The Germans would regroup. They would try to counter. But the arithmetic of war had shifted permanently. Every line, every ridge, every valley could be counted upon by the Americans. Every Sherman arriving at the front was a promise. For every loss, 2 more would follow. For every defensive success, it would be too late. Harper stared into the night, listening to the distant engine hums, the echoing gunfire, and the wind through the ruins. He understood what his officers had drilled into him. Production was war. Scale was war. Numbers were destiny. And America had doubled the destiny the Germans had ever imagined. The English Channel roared under a gray spring sky, waves slamming against cliffs and beaches, wind whipping the salt spray into the eyes of the men below. On the southern coast of England, American and British logistics crews worked tirelessly, ferrying Sherman tanks, supplies, and artillery from massive ports into staging areas stretching for miles. Every inch of the coastline hummed with activity. Pallets of shells, crates of rifles, and columns of tanks rolled along roads and railways, as if the countryside itself had become a living armory. Captain Edward Malone walked between rows of tanks, inspecting the engines, the treads, the newly fitted turrets. His hand rested on the side of a Sherman, feeling the cold steel vibrate with potential. Each tank carried 75 millimeters of firepower, multiple machine guns, and a trained crew ready to make it a mobile fortress. Malone had seen combat in North Africa and Italy. He knew what the Shermans could do. But here, lined up in hundreds, ready to move in a single unstoppable wave, they felt like something more than machines. They felt like destiny. Across the Channel, German intelligence officers watched reports with growing alarm. Reconnaissance photos showed camps and staging areas crowded with Sherman tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and soldiers training relentlessly. Where they had anticipated thousands, they now counted tens of thousands, columns stretching for kilometers. The laughter that greeted reports of 25 Zero tanks 2 years prior was gone. Silence filled the war rooms instead, a cold realization that Germany was facing an industrial juggernaut capable of delivering twice the tanks they had mocked. Meanwhile, in the marshes of East Anglia, crews ran through final exercises. Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes led his squad in synchronized maneuvers, tanks advancing in wedge formations, switching flanks, coordinating with infantry and artillery in perfect harmony. In the days that followed, the Allies pushed inland. The Shermans rolled through hedgerows, supporting infantry in clearing villages, neutralizing artillery positions, and advancing the front steadily. German defenses were dismantled piece by piece. Panic and disbelief spread among the ranks. Every calculation of advantage, every carefully prepared defensive plan, crumbled under the relentless multiplication of American armored forces. Harper watched from a ridge as another column of Shermans advanced through a sunken road, machine guns rattling, engines roaring. They had crossed half the Normandy countryside already. The Germans scrambled to respond, deploying reserves where they could, but for every tank they moved forward, 3 more were already in position. The arithmetic of war had shifted irrevocably. Numbers had become strategy, scale had become a weapon, and the Shermans were its unyielding embodiment. By the end of the first week, the Allies had expanded the beachhead far beyond German expectations. The laughter that had once echoed in Berlin over 25 Zero American tanks had been replaced by horror, disbelief, and the stark understanding that they faced not just skillful soldiers, but the relentless power of industrial supremacy manifest on the battlefield. Every Sherman that rolled forward was a testament to production, coordination, and planning a tangible answer to every miscalculation. The Germans retreated toward the hedgerows, their panzers fewer than expected, their morale fractured. Harper and his crew, exhausted but alert, knew that the fight would continue, but the pattern was clear. America had multiplied its power, and Germany could not match it. The Shermans had proven themselves as both weapon and message, that the war could be won not just by tactics, but by the relentless, coordinated weight of numbers. Harper looked across the fields, smoke curling from demolished bunkers, the metallic scent of burned armor thick in the air. He understood that this was only the beginning. The build-up in Britain, the crossing of the Channel, the endless supply lines, all of it led to a conclusion that was now inevitable. Germany had laughed at 25 Zero tanks. America had built 50 Zero, and now, on the rolling fields of Normandy, they were paying the price of that misjudgment. The winter of 1944 pressed down on the European plains like a steel weight. Snow blanketed the forests of the Ardennes, and frozen rivers cut through the countryside like veins of ice. American Sherman tanks rolled steadily forward, their treads carving furrows in the frost-hardened earth, engines humming with the promise of inexorable force. Lieutenant Daniel Harper leaned into the chill, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of German resistance, his gloves numb but his grip steady on the controls. Reports from reconnaissance flights indicated the remnants of German panzer divisions were massing near the Rhine, their numbers diminished, but their pride intact. Harper knew better than to underestimate them. He had seen what clever tactics could do in Italy, how fortified positions and ambushes could stall an advance. But the arithmetic of war had changed, and the Germans were facing not just tactics, but an unbroken tide of tanks and men that had no end in sight. The first shots of the day tore through the still air. A Tiger fired, catching a Sherman in its crosshairs. Sparks flew as armor twisted under the impact, yet the Sherman crew held firm. Another Sherman rolled forward from the line behind, bringing its 75mm gun to bear. Bang! The Tiger shuddered, smoke curling from its turret. In seconds, a second Sherman flanked it, the combined fire of two tanks bringing down one of Germany's prideful behemoths. Every skirmish revealed the truth the Germans could no longer deny. For every tank they destroyed, two more were waiting to take its place. Supply lines remained uninterrupted, and the factories of America had transformed into a relentless engine of war, pumping out steel and crude machines faster than battle could deplete them. Harper felt it in the rhythm of the battlefield, in the steady advance of armor, in the coordination that turned chaos into a moving tide of iron. Behind the front lines, German officers struggled to adapt. Panzer divisions were scattered, their units fragmented, their communications overloaded by the scale of the American advance. They had expected parity, maybe even superiority in certain sectors, but instead they faced a flood of Shermans, each equipped, crewed, and trained to work as part of a system far larger than themselves. Morale frayed as reports streamed in. Tanks lost in one sector were replaced in 2 hours by fresh arrivals, artillery positions neutralized by coordinated tank infantry maneuvers, and flanking attacks met with overwhelming counterfire. In the villages along the Rhine, Harper's squadron moved with quiet precision, advancing through streets littered with wreckage and debris. Civilians fled alongside the armored columns, eyes wide with fear and relief, unsure which would strike first, the collapse of the German defense or the advancing wave of American armor. Each Sherman carried not only firepower, but the psychological weight of inevitability, a rolling embodiment of industrial might brought to bear against entrenched defenders. The German command attempted a counteroffensive, concentrating what remained of their armor in a last desperate attempt to stall the Americans. But the Shermans were already in position. Harper's tank moved into a narrow valley, guns trained on concealed Panzer IVs and the occasional Tiger lurking behind stone walls. The first shots of the engagement erupted in fire and smoke, but the Americans pressed forward. For every vehicle destroyed, 2 more advanced from behind. By mid-afternoon, the German counterattack had faltered, units retreating in disarray under relentless pressure. Harper's crew, exhausted yet alert, moved in perfect coordination with adjacent squadrons. Each Sherman's movement was calculated, every shell aimed with precision, every man in tune with the others. The numbers worked not just as arithmetic, but as momentum, a force that crushed resistance by sheer inevitability. The Germans had mocked 25-0 tanks, but now they were contending with 50-0, and the effects were undeniable. Across the lines, communication between German units broke down. Panic and disbelief spread. Experienced commanders who had once scoffed at American production now found themselves making impossible decisions, trying to conserve forces that were outnumbered, outpaced, and outmaneuvered at every turn. Harper realized the significance of it all. The war was no longer a question of individual skill or tactical genius. It had become a demonstration of scale, endurance, and coordination, and America had mastered all three. By February 1945, the Allies had crossed the Rhine. German defenses collapsed under the unrelenting tide of armor and infantry. Harper's Shermans moved through towns, clearing remaining pockets of resistance, providing cover for advancing infantry, and neutralizing artillery positions with pinpoint accuracy. Every village taken, every ridge secured, further demonstrated the catastrophic impact of America's production capabilities. The numbers they had once laughed at now dictated the rhythm and outcome of battle. In one of the last German strongholds, an officer stared at a map in disbelief. Entire divisions had been destroyed or forced to retreat. Supply lines were non-existent, reinforcements scattered. The arithmetic of war was inescapable. America had not just produced tanks, they had produced dominance, multiplying it across the battlefield until resistance was futile. Harper's tank advanced into the outskirts of a bombed-out city. Smoke hung over the streets like a curtain. German soldiers surrendered in small groups, exhausted, bewildered, and finally accepting what the numbers had dictated. For months, Harper and his crew had moved forward, overcoming ambushes, bunkers, and artillery. And for every obstacle, for every enemy they destroyed, 2 more Shermans were ready to replace them, continuing the inexorable advance. By May, the Allies were deep into Germany. Harper's division linked with British and Canadian forces, forming a continuous armored front that swept through the Ruhr, neutralizing factories, bridges, and transportation hubs. The German industrial machine had been crippled long before the Allies arrived, but the tanks ensured that no stronghold could hold. Each Sherman was a force multiplier, a psychological weapon, and a symbol of the industrial might that Germany had once mocked. Finally, the war in Europe drew to a close. Harper's squadron entered Berlin in the aftermath, tanks rolling through streets scarred by months of conflict. The German leaders who had once laughed at American tank production were gone, their calculations and pride buried under the relentless arithmetic of 50 Zero Shermans. The cities, forests, and plains of Europe bore witness to a simple truth. When a nation harnesses its industrial capacity, trains its soldiers, and multiplies its power, even the most formidable army can be overwhelmed. Harper dismounted, resting his hand on the steel of his Sherman's turret. He looked back across the landscape of battle-smoldering ruins, wrecked panzers, villages liberated, and understood the quiet magnitude of what they had accomplished. Numbers, discipline, and coordination had reshaped the battlefield. The Germans had laughed. America had built 50 Zero tanks, and the consequences had been absolute. The war had ended, but the lesson remained. Industrial power, harnessed with precision and backed by determination, could dictate outcomes more decisively than tactics alone. For Harper, his crew, and every man who had seen the Shermans roll across North Africa, Italy, and Europe, the echo of those engines would forever carry the memory of a force unstoppable in both scale and resolve.